Hello, my beautiful listeners. Tonight's sleep story will take us to see philosophers in ancient Greece like Aristotle and Plato, and take us over to 19th century Germany, where we will see when psychology fully became its own discipline. We will delve into the world of famous Europeans like René Descartes and Sigmund Freud, and we'll even talk about the dark side of this famous Austrian psychoanalyst. We will move through the history of psychology and all of the schools of thought, including Structuralism, Functionalism, Behaviourism, and cognitive psychology. So relax, get comfortable. As always, I will list my references in the description. You may lie down and shut your eyes if you like, because everything you need to know is going to be whispered in your ears. I will also include timestamps in case you fall asleep and wish to pick up this story later on. So with that, let's get going. Psychology itself did not emerge as its own discipline until the late 1800s. But its influences began thousands of years earlier, tracing back to the ancient Greeks. You have probably heard of Aristotle, a philosopher and polymath in the classical period of ancient Greece. Well, he can be given credit for formulating the foundations of psychology. Many Greek philosophers studied how human personality and character were expressed as either part of rational, deductive processes or as impaired, irrational processes. And Aristotle was no different. His study of the philosophy of the mind and his empirical approach to his studies is considered the forerunner of the modern psychological approach. Furthermore, an interesting critical approach in therapy the ancient Greeks used to understand individual human anxiety was dream interpretation. The Greek thinker Artemidorus in the 2nd century BCE wrote Onoratica, the first Greek book of dream interpretation, after he travelled and collected people's recollections of dreams and whether what could be called their outcomes matched their dreams by some form of logic. He divided the dreams into two types: theoretic or direct dreams, whereby the dreams correspond exactly to the dream vision, i.e. a man at sea dreamt he suffered a shipwreck, and it came true in the way presented in sleep. On the other hand, Artemidorus said there are allegorical dreams, or indirect dreams, in which the dream signifies one thing by means of another. In other words, through them the soul is conveying something obscurely by physical means. We will discuss dream interpretation later in the video when we discuss Freud. Artemidorus also tried to understand the personal immediate circumstances and overall context of the dreamer as a holistic approach, believing that the least possible item could greatly influence the dream and how to understand its meaning. This anticipates modern diagnosis as well, and is also part of the scientific method of isolating variables in an experiment. Just a quick sidebar, I've got this lovely flickering flame candle here. To add a bit of atmosphere. And these are all books that I've collected. I'm a psychologist. I have a master's degree in clinical psychology. And as you can tell, this is a subject that really interests me. So, anyway, to continue, other Greeks also had an influence. For example, Plato, who was Aristotle's teacher. He developed the theory of forms. Plato then developed, after the theory of forms, a framework of human behaviour as he attempted to learn and study how humans reason and how impulses are developed. In fact, in his theory of forms, he states that the psyche defines the mind and the soul. Plato's Republic Book 4 theorised what Plato developed as 3 interconnected parts of the tripartite soul of the psyche. First, logistikon was the intellect, or part of the mind as the seat of reasoning and logic. Second, epithoumetikon was the appetitive part of the soul, focusing on base desires. Third, thumoides was the emotional part of the soul or mind that dictated feelings. The thuomides also invoked and enforced logistikon to govern desires and appetites of the epithoumetikon, in some function possibly parallel to what some have later called will. According to Plato, the healthy mind maintained a balance between the 3 parts. For example, for Plato, the appetitive part of the soul, seeking base desires for food and drink, should nonetheless be governed by the other 2 parts, intellect or logistikon, and emotions or thuomides. Even today, we identify that organ of the chest, which we now know is tied to our immune system, where the Greeks thought emotions were felt, still named the thymus, in a sense after Plato. We could talk about Plato and the ancient Greeks all day. They discussed issues like anxiety, depression, and trauma. And both the Greeks and the Romans were among the first to recognise mental illness as a medical condition that also influenced physical health. At times, of course, they may also have some bizarre ways of treating certain conditions. For example, many believe that hysteria, from hyster or womb in Greek, was a condition for which only women were treated, or that depression could be treated by bathing, although this may not be so strange, or that psychosis was treatable by bloodletting of an excess of black bile, hence melancholia. However, at the same time, many ancient cultures had a sensible realization that positive words and hope had value in healing the soul. Even the biblical Proverbs 17:22 said, "A merry heart does good like medicine, but a crushed spirit dries the bones." Or Proverbs 15:1, "A soft answer turns away wrath, but a grievous answer stirs up anger." On the other hand, where superstition and ignorance prevailed, proper medical treatment was limited by false diagnosis and false or even harmful practices. Other civilizations likely had some discussion of psychology and related principles, but lack of written word means that this is lost to us. What we do know, however, is the importance of psychology and psychological issues has transcended culture and time. We will now jump forward to the 17th century, to a French philosopher called René Descartes. He introduced the idea of dualism, which asserted that the mind and body were two entities that interact to form the human experience. Dualism allowed for the separation of sciences and the non-physical realm, which was important in this era because it allowed scientists to conduct their research without fear of being considered heretics by religious groups. Dualism creates a problem for psychologists and the study of the mind. Psychologists can ignore the mind entirely and view behaviour as purely mechanical, or include the mind in study but it not be considered scientific. I am actually planning a video solely on Descartes and his philosophy and influence, so I will leave his work there for now. The discipline of physiology had an impact on the history of psychology. Physiology is the study of how the human body works. Physiology also has its roots with the ancient Greeks, but was well studied throughout the early modern period and late modern period as well. Early physiological research on the brain behaviour had a dramatic impact on psychology, ultimately contributing to applying scientific methodologies to the study of human thought and behaviour. Now, psychology emerges. During the mid-1800s, a German physiologist named Wilhelm Wundt was using scientific research methods to investigate reaction times. His book, published in 1873, Principles of Physiological Psychology, outlined many of the major connections between the science of physiology and the study of human thought and behaviour. He later opened the world's first psychology lab in 1879 at the University of Leipzig. This event is generally considered the official start of psychology as a separate and distinct scientific discipline. How did Wundt view psychology? He perceived the subject as the study of human consciousness and sought to apply experimental methods to studying internal mental processes. While his use of a process known as introspection is seen as unreliable and unscientific today, his early work in psychology helped set the stage for future experimental methods. An estimated 17,000 students attended Wundt's psychology lectures, and hundreds more pursued degrees in psychology and studied in his lab. While his influence dwindled as the field matured, his impact on psychology is unquestionable and has been known as the father of modern psychology. In addition to making psychology a separate science, Wundt also had a number of students who went on to become influential psychologists themselves. James McKean Cattell became the first professor of psychology in the United States, and G. Stanley Hall established the first experimental psychology lab in the US. Also, Edward B. Titchener was responsible for establishing the school of thought known as Structuralism. As I've just said, one of Wundt's most famous pupils, Edward Titchener, went on to establish psychology's first school of thought, Structuralism. Structuralism is a theory of consciousness that seeks to analyse the elements of mental experiences, such as sensations, mental images, and feelings, and how these elements combine to form more complex experiences. Titchener proposed 3 elementary states of consciousness: sensations, like sights, sounds, and tastes; images, which are components of thoughts; and affections, which are components of emotions. Structuralism looked to examine the adult mind in terms of analysing the basic elements of thoughts and sensations, and although afterwards to discover the manner by which these segments fit together in complex structures. Structuralism's main technique was called introspection, a highly practiced form of self-examination. He trained psychology students to make observations that were biased by personal interpretation or previous experience, and used the results to develop a theory of conscious thought. Highly trained assistants would be given a stimulus such as a ticking metronome and would reflect on the experience. They would report what the stimulus made them think and feel. The same stimulus, physical surroundings, and instructions were given to each person. Wundt's method of introspection did not remain a fundamental tool of psychological experimentation past the early 1920s. His greatest contribution was to show that psychology could be a valid experimental science. Titchener trained his students to become skilled at trained introspection, and to report only the sensations as they were experienced without a reliance on meaning words, which he called a stimulus error. Using this approach, Titchener's students reported various visual, auditory, tactile, and etc. experiences. In An Outline of Psychology in 1899, he reported over 44,000 elements of sensation, including 32,820 visual, 11,600 auditory, and 4 taste. However, while structuralism is notable for its emphasis on scientific research, its methods were unreliable, limiting, and subjective. When Titchener died in 1927, structuralism essentially died with him. The next school of thought in psychology that emerged was functionalism. Psychology began to flourish in the United States in the mid to late 1800s. William James emerged as one of the major American psychologists during this period, and publishing his classic textbook, The Principles of Psychology, established him as the father of American psychology. His book soon became the standard text in psychology, and his ideas eventually served as the basis for a new school of thought known as functionalism. The focus of functionalism was about how behaviour actually works to help people live in their environment. Functionalists utilised methods such as direct observation to study the human mind and behaviour. Functionalism emerged to counter the German-led theory of structuralism. Functionists, including psychologists William James and James Roland Angell, and philosophers George H. Mead, Archibald L. Moore, and John Dewey, stressed the importance of empirical rational thought over an experimental, trial-and-error philosophy. The group was more concerned with the capability of the mind than with the process of thought. The movement was thus interested primarily in the practical applications of research. The union between theory and application reached its zenith through John Dewey's development of a laboratory school at the University of Chicago in 1896, and the publication of his keystone article, The Reflex Arc Concept in Psychology, 1896, which attacked the philosophy of atomism and the concept of elementarism, including the behavioural theory of stimulus and response. The work of John Dewey and his associates stimulated the progressive school movement, which attempted to apply functionalist principles to education. In the early and mid-20th century, an offshoot theory emerged, the transactional theory of perception, the central thesis of which is that learning is the key to perceiving. Although functionalism has never become a formal, prescriptive school, it has served as a historic link in the philosophical evolution, linking the structuralists' concern with the anatomy of the mind to the concentration on the functions of the mind and, later, to the development and growth of behaviourism. Up until this point, early psychology stressed the conscious human experience. An Austrian physician named Sigmund Freud changed the face of psychology in a dramatic way, proposing a theory of personality that emphasised the importance of the unconscious mind. Freud's clinical work with patients suffering from hysteria and other ailments led him to believe that early childhood experiences and unconscious impulses contributed to the development of adult personality and behaviour. In his book, The Psychopathology of Everyday Life, Freud detailed how these unconscious thoughts and impulses are expressed, often through slips of the tongue, now known as Freudian slips, and dreams. He wrote a book on dream interpretation called The Interpretation of Dreams, published in 1901. According to Freud, psychological disorders are the result of these unconscious conflicts becoming extreme or unbalanced. The psychoanalytic theory proposed by Sigmund Freud had a tremendous impact on 20th century thought, influencing the mental health field as well as other areas, including art, literature, and popular culture. While many of his ideas are viewed with scepticism today, his influence on psychology is undeniable. He was the first to suggest that childhood abuse exists, which was extremely shocking to Victorian society. Freud developed a sort of cult following in a sense. He had very loyal followers, but these followers often fell out with Freud after a few years, as he could not stand for students questioning his theory or making their own adjustments. Famously, Carl Jung was an influential student of Freud, but they only exchanged letters in later life, as Jung came up with his own form of psychoanalysis and wrote this book on the nature of the psyche. Freud's theories are largely thought to be non-scientific these days, and while psychoanalysis still exists, it's by far not the most common modern approach. In fact, certain facts about Freud put him in a bad light, and he's definitely not a hero figure. He was an avid drug user. He was very fond of cocaine. At one point, he described his patients' memories of childhood sexual abuse as fantasy and made up, and so in his own way suggests that children sexualise their parents in that situation and not the other way around. He was also a serious misogynist. He thought women to be weak, vain, jealous, and lacking a good sense of justice. He believed women's problems came from penis envy, and that women were the problem of society. He described his own daughter, Anna, as a jealous, depressed, masochistic, anorectic, latent homosexual teenager. If any of you have watched The Crown, one episode documents Freud's interactions with Prince Philip's mother, Princess Alice of Battenberg, and the account is very disturbing, so I won't repeat it here. Let's move on now to behaviourism. By the early 20th century, psychology had become a booming discipline, with numerous journalists published on various topics. Behaviourism was a modern take on psychology and quickly rose to dominance. Behaviourism was a major change from previous theoretical perspectives, rejecting the emphasis on both the conscious and unconscious mind. Instead, behaviourism strove to make psychology a more scientific discipline by focusing purely on observable behaviour. Behaviourism had its earliest start with the work of a Russian physiologist named Ivan Pavlov. Pavlov's research on the digestive systems of dogs led to his discovery of the classical conditioning process, which proposed that behaviours could be learned via conditioned associations. Pavlov demonstrated that this learning process could be used to make an association between an environmental stimulus and a naturally occurring stimulus. An American psychologist named John B. Watson soon became one of the strongest advocates of behaviourism, initially outlining the basic principles of this new school of thought in his 1913 paper, Psychology as the Behaviourist Views It. Watson later went on to offer a definition in his classic book, Behaviourism, in 1924, writing, "Behaviourism holds that the subject matter of human psychology is the behaviour of the human being. Behaviourism claims that consciousness is neither a definite nor a usable concept. The behaviourist, who has always been trained as an experimentalist, holds further that belief in the existence of consciousness goes back to the ancient days of superstition and magic." The impact of behaviourism was enormous, and this school of thought continued to dominate for the next 50 years. Psychologist B.F. Skinner furthered the behaviourist perspective with his concept of operant conditioning, which demonstrated the effect of punishment and reinforcement on behaviour. While behaviourism eventually lost its dominant grip on psychology, the basic principles of behavioural psychology are still widely in use today. Therapeutic techniques such as behaviour analysis, behavioural modification, and token economies are often utilised to help children learn new skills and overcome maladaptive behaviours, while conditioning is used in many situations, ranging from parenting to education. Now let's quickly talk about humanism. During the later half of the 20th century, a new school of thought emerged called Humanism. In direct contrast to behaviourism, this perspective emphasised conscious experiences. American psychologist Carl Rogers is often considered to be one of the founders of this school of thought. While psychoanalysts looked at unconscious impulses and behaviourists focused on environmental causes, Rogers believed strongly in the power of free will and self-determination. Psychologist Abraham Maslow also contributed to humanistic psychology with his famous hierarchy of needs theory of human motivation. This theory suggested that people were motivated by increasingly complex needs. Once the most basic needs are fulfilled, people then become motivated to pursue higher level needs. During the 1950s and 60s, a movement known as the cognitive revolution began to take hold in psychology. During this time, cognitive psychology began to replace psychoanalysis and behaviourism as the dominant approach to the study of psychology. Psychologists were still interested in looking at observable behaviours, but they were also interested and concerned with what was going on inside the mind. Since that time, cognitive psychology has remained a dominant area of psychology, as researchers continue to study things such as perception, memory, decision-making, problem-solving, intelligence, and language. The introduction of brain imaging tools such as MRI and PET scanning have helped improve the ability of researchers to more closely study the inner workings of the human brain. In fact, one of the most commonly used therapies today is cognitive behavioural therapy, or CBT, which combines both cognitive and behaviourist schools of thought. It focuses on pinpointing thinking patterns and beliefs which are harmful and works to change those thoughts, with the idea that this will lead to a change in behaviour. So, what about women? When discussing the history of psychology, it does read as very male-oriented. We must not forget the contribution of women to psychology, however. For most of its history, women were not permitted to go to university and study to become psychologists until the 20th century. Later on, I think. We must remember the many, many female patients that informed Freud's work and other psychologists' work. Specifically, though, there are some women that did impact psychology as an emerging discipline. For example, Mary Whitton Culkins, who rightfully earned a doctorate from Harvard, although the school refused to grant her a degree because she was a woman. She studied with major thinkers of the day like William James, Josiah Royce, and Hugo Munsterberg. Despite the obstacles she faced, she became the American Psychological Association's first female president. Anna Freud, who made important contributions to the field of psychoanalysis. She described many of the defense mechanisms and is known as the founder of child psychoanalysis. She also was an influence on other psychologists, including Erik Erikson. And Mary Ainsworth, who was a developmental psychologist. She made important contributions to our understanding of attachment. She developed a technique for studying child and caregiver attachments known as the strange situation assessment. Psychology continues to grow today, and it becomes an ever-necessary discipline. Mental health problems are on the rise, and most people will experience depression or anxiety in one form or another during their lifetime, whether themselves or with a loved one. With advanced technology, we can explore new methods of treatment. For example, virtual reality exposure therapy, which uses virtual reality headsets to combat problems such as phobias, trauma, and psychosis. As psychologists, we will continue to explore new modes to help mental health. Personally, I view ASMR itself as a little explored therapy. On my channel, I have a playlist called Psychotherapy, where I've listed my videos where I try and help your mental health. Whether it's ASMR meditations for depression or anxiety, or eye movement desensitization therapy for trauma, the application of ASMR in psychology is massive and very much growing. Thank you for listening to my story. Lots of love. Perception ASMR.